Well, it is my privilege to introduce to you our next presenter, Dr. Carmen Imes. Excuse me. Dr. Imes is an associate professor of Old Testament at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University, where she served since 2021. She also completed her undergraduate studies here at Multnomah, earning her MA from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and her PhD at Wheaton College. Dr. Imes is passionate for helping students engage the Old Testament, discovering its relevance for Christian identity and mission. She's the author of Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters, and her most recent book entitled Being God's Image, Why Creation Still Matters. Dr. Imes contributes widely through both her speaking and her writing. She's a fellow with Every Voice, a center for kingdom diversity in the global body of Christ, as well as serves on the board of the Institute for Biblical Research as a program chair. Dr. Imes is also well known for her scholarly yet accessible weekly YouTube teaching, Torah Tuesday. So Bible nerds, would you please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Carmen Imes.
Oh, what a joy to be here. It's not only is it an extreme honor to be part of celebrating the work of our esteemed mentor, Ray Lubeck, but it's also somewhat of a class reunion. We had a disproportionate number of nerds, I think, in our class, and if you were intimidated by the amazing presentation you just heard, imagine being in Greek class with that guy. I was getting straight A's in Greek, but I felt like Andy was so far out in front of me, I just could see the dust cloud behind him. It is such fun to be back together with all of you. I was asked to share a little story just to lighten things up. So I'll tell a story about Andy's wife, Denise, who is here, and I and Jill, then Spoolstra, now Bott, whose husband will be presenting later today in a breakout session. We heard Ray tell lots of stories about his time as a student at Multnomah and the mischief that he worked on campus. And one of his campus jobs was to clean the library after hours. And one time he thought it would be funny to go through the entire library and turn every book around backwards. And so he did that, and he told us the story, and we thought that was great. And we decided, since every student, when fully trained, should be like their teacher, we had connections, and we were let into his office after hours and turned all of his books around backwards one time. And he was the kind of professor that you could have fun with, which is really fun. Well, today I'm going to be talking about an enigmatic story in the book of Exodus. I'm writing a commentary on Exodus for Baker Academic, and so I've spent a lot of hours examining the literary structure of the book and trying to uncover and unpack its mysteries. And one of the mysteries that people are pretty quick to point to is the story of Zipporah in chapter 4, which is, can we all agree, so weird. So, to my mind, this is the most mysterious text in the book, and it raises all kinds of literary, historical, and theological questions that evade explanation. And so today I'm going to explore it with you, and what I hope to demonstrate is that this story is key to the literary design of Exodus, and it was Ray who taught me how to think about and explore that literary design, so I hope that this is helpful for you as well. So let's start with looking at what this strange little story is. And if you have a Bible, it would be useful for you to have it open to chapter 4 as well. So this is the part in question. Now it happened on the way where they set up camp that Yahweh met him and sought to put him to death. But Zipporah took flint and cut the foreskin of her son, obviously, and she made it touch his feet. And then she said, "You are my blood relative." So he drew back from him when she said blood relative because of the circumcisions. There are so many questions that arise from this text. Why is Moses entirely passive in this story? Which him is Yahweh trying to kill? Is it Moses or is it Zipporah's son? If it's Moses, why would Yahweh try to kill Moses as he is obeying Yahweh's commission? Why had Moses not circumcised his son already? Was Moses himself already circumcised? How did Zipporah know what ritual action to take? She seems to work quickly. How did she know? Why not name Zipporah's son? Is this Gershom? Is it Eleazar? To whom does she speak? Her son, Moses, Yahweh? She makes this proclamation. You are my blood relative, but it doesn't tell us who she's talking to. Whose feet does Zipporah touch with the foreskin? Is it her son's, Moses' feet, Yahweh's feet? And is this a reference to actual feet? Or is this a euphemism for male genitalia, which it does function that way in other texts? And then who drew back from whom after Zipporah performed the ritual? And what does her statement even mean? So we have our work cut out for us in the next 20 minutes and 36 seconds. The list of ambiguities is impressive for a story that spans only 3 verses. The narration seems intentionally laconic and enigmatic, and these unanswered questions draw readers into the story, piquing our curiosity while destabilizing narrative flow. This scene, I've come to decide, is a zone of turbulence into which we as readers are suddenly caught unprepared, while our assumptions about God and the nature of God's relationship with his people are upended. So in this moment of grave danger in which readers themselves experience uncertainty, Zipporah acts decisively and efficiently. In the span of a single verse, she cuts, touches, and speaks. And the ritual efficacy of her words and actions is evident because danger is successfully averted. Somehow, she knew what to do, and it worked. Meanwhile, the relief of resolution is paired with the unsettling feeling that this God and his commission do not fit our categories. This uncomfortable encounter with the mystery of God's ways prepares us to experience the signs and wonders in Egypt as the means by which we will come to know this mysterious God, Yahweh. In response to Moses' demand that Pharaoh release his servants to serve Yahweh instead, Pharaoh claimed ignorance. Who's Yahweh? That I should obey him and send Israel away. I don't know Yahweh, and I will not send Israel away. After this incident on the way to Egypt, readers may entertain sympathies with Pharaoh's perspective. I thought I knew Yahweh, but I'm not so sure anymore. Who is Yahweh anyway? Can Yahweh be trusted? To put it another way, the Zipporah story cracks open our own need to come to terms with Yahweh by destabilizing our assumptions and exposing us to the mystery of divine purposes. So what I'd like to do in the time we have left is to talk first about the microstructure and then about the macrostructure of this incident and of the design of Exodus, to show you that it is not a random archaic memory that's being included for the sake of completeness, but rather this story functions as an integral part of a larger series of interrelated scenes that unfold in, we'll begin with chapter 4, verses 18 to 31, and here is where it's helpful if you have your Bible open, because then you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. There is a beautiful chiasm here, in which first, in verse 18, Moses takes leave of Jethro to return to his brothers in Egypt. And then in scene 7, these are little micro scenes, most of them are only a verse long. Moses and his brother Aaron arrive in Egypt. In scene 2, Yahweh recommissions Moses. In scene 6, Yahweh commissions Aaron to meet Moses. In scene 3, Moses, his wife, and sons travel. In scene 5, which is the one we're trying to figure out, Moses, his wife, and sons escape Yahweh's threat. And then in scene 4, right in the very center, is Yahweh's threat to Pharaoh's firstborn. And I think we need to read this weird story in its context so that we can come to appreciate why it's here. The connection between each scene and its chiastic counterpart is fairly evident. However, like some chiasms that only exhibit links between the paired elements, this one has all sorts of other links that bind it together as a passage that we can't read, like we can't read one of these verses on its own. So scenes 1 and 5 both mention the chatan, or relative by marriage. Scenes 2 and 5 both speak of a threat to Moses, first from Pharaoh, then from Yahweh, both of whom seek to kill. Scene 3 mentions Moses' staff, while in scene 7, Aaron performed the prescribed sign with the staff. Scenes 3 and 7 are also linked by the mention of Moses gathering sons, first his own and then the sons of Israel. Within scene 4, Yahweh mentions God's own firstborn, Israel, as well as Pharaoh's, unveiling in advance the divine logic behind the death of Egypt's firstborn. Scenes 4 and 5 both issue a threat from Yahweh, first to kill Pharaoh's and then to kill Moses' son, or Moses. Scenes 5 and 6 both speak of an encounter, a pagash, with Moses. Yahweh's was threatening, while Aaron's involved a kiss of greeting, but it's the same word. So I don't have all the cool arrows that Andy had in his presentation, but you get the idea. There's a whole bunch of tightly connected links here. So these features reveal Exodus 4:18-31 as a deliberately crafted narrative sequence designed to be read as a unit. Yahweh made clear to Moses that Pharaoh's son would be under threat because of Pharaoh's anticipated failure to comply with Yahweh's demands. Moses could not speak with divine authority to Pharaoh if he was not in compliance with those demands himself. Moses' failure to circumcise his own son put his entire family at risk because they did not meet they put his entire family at risk of the consequences of his own message. By returning to Egypt with uncircumcised sons, Moses had not met the qualifications of covenant membership of the descendants of Abraham, and so this put his family in a perilous position. As for the question of whose life was under threat, Moses or Gershom, reading 4:24-26 in its context allows for either possibility. However, I think the solution emerges by attending to the larger concern regarding Moses' identity in these early chapters of Exodus. So think through the story of Exodus with me. Moses is born and nursed by a Hebrew, but raised by an adoptive Egyptian mother, the daughter of Pharaoh. And although we don't know how many daughters Pharaoh had or what relationship Moses would have had with Pharaoh, presumably he's growing up in the palace. He's growing up among royalty. But his own ethnic and cultural identity remains uncertain. He goes out to his own people and tries to rescue them and kills an Egyptian, but then the Hebrew people reject him. So he's rejected by the Hebrews. He's rejected by the household of Pharaoh. He flees for his life through the wilderness, shows up in Midian, and fails to identify himself. There's a type scene, of course, of what happens when a patriarch shows up at a well. By the end of the scene, he's always married. And that works here too. Moses shows up at the well, and by the end of the scene, he's married, but he's missing one of the elements of the type scene that usually occurs, and that is self-identification. Moses doesn't say who he is. So when the daughters go to Jethro to say, this dude saved us at the well, they identify him as an Egyptian. An Egyptian saved us today. So we have, again, ambiguity about his status. And then he has his firstborn, and he names him Gershom, foreigner there, because he's become a foreigner. And I don't know, as I'm reading, what does he mean? Does he mean he used to be an Egyptian, and then he was considered a foreigner in Egypt? Or he used to be a Hebrew, and then he was a foreigner to the Hebrews? Or he used to be at home, and now he's a foreigner in Midian? Like, what does he mean? We don't know. He has this sense of uncertainty about his status. And when Yahweh appears to him at Mount Sinai in the burning bush, the first thing he settles is Moses' identity. I am the God of your father. And if I'm Moses, this is the part where I'm like, okay, time out. Could you clarify that for me a minute? Which father are we talking about? My Hebrew father, my Egyptian father, my Midianite father-in-law? Like, who are you? And so God, and normally it's, I am the God of your fathers. But this place, God says, I am the God of your father, singular. As if to emphasize, you only have one father, Moses, and let me tell you right now who it is. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that identifies Moses as being part of the covenant community, but he has apparently failed to identify himself as a member of the covenant community by following the one rule that they had at this point in history, which is circumcision. So these taken together, these clues point to paint an uncertain portrait of Moses' identity in chapter 2. He's a sociological hybrid, fully belonging nowhere. And that has got to be settled before he goes back. If he's going back to announce to Pharaoh the death of the firstborn, he better be very sure he's not the firstborn of Pharaoh, right? And so this scene with Zipporah is settling that question. All right, let me fast forward here to the macro structure of the book. I contend that this strange series of incidents is not simply an aside, but is key to the structure of Exodus as a whole. So I hope I've convinced you. We have to read it in its immediate context because there's all these connections. But this story also helps us with the larger context of the book. So you might have noticed the symmetry between the rescue of Moses and the rescue of Israel in Exodus. So think it through with me, because in a variety of ways, Moses' own rescue story anticipates the rescue story of the whole nation. He's under threat of death from Pharaoh. He's put in the reeds and delivered, rescued. And later, the threat of death from Pharaoh is renewed as an adult, and he takes off and crosses the wilderness, arrives at Mount Sinai, where he experiences a divine theophany and is commissioned for God's service. And then the cycle starts over again. He goes back to the people who are under threat from Pharaoh, and he delivers them through the Sea of Reeds. The Bible never calls it the Red Sea. It's always the Sea of Reeds in Hebrew. Paralleling the reeds that he was hidden in the Nile. They cross the wilderness. They arrive at Mount Sinai where they experience a theophany, and then God commissions them for his service. So there's the entire book of Exodus could be pictured in this way in two panels, where Moses' story is like a microcosm of the story of the whole nation. And so now we can ask, where does the Zipporah story fit in this, and how does it help us? Well, one of the most striking elements of the first movement, the rescue of Moses, is the role of women in rescuing him. The midwives, the daughter of Levi, the daughter of Pharaoh, the baby's sister, the handmaids, each of these women defied Pharaoh at great risk to herself. At the close of the first movement, Zipporah rescued Moses from threat of death by circumcising their son. As such, the story of Moses is framed by the women who save him. Okay, so in Hebrew, the name Zipporah sounds like Shiphrah, one of the valiant midwives of chapter 1. In fact, in the Greek Septuagint, the names are identical. So we have this identical framing of the rescuer of Moses, but women on either end. And I think the narrator wants us to remember that Moses is being rescued by these women. Notably, the narrator characterizes these women's actions using many of the same verbs that later depict Yahweh's action in saving Israel. And I forgot to say one thing. Here's Miriam taking her stand by the edge of the Nile to watch the deliverance of her baby brother and participating in it. And here's Miriam with the people of Israel taking her stand again, by the shores of the Sea of Reeds, celebrating the deliverance of the people. So Miriam also has a significant role in the literary shaping of this book because she bears witness to the deliverance on both occasions, again, using the same verb. It's so much fun. Moses also takes his stand by the Nile to confront Pharaoh as he's coming down to the Nile when he begins his signs. And he's just doing exactly what his big sister had done so many years before. She took her stand and confronted the daughter of Pharaoh as she was coming down to the Nile. It's so fun. Okay, but I only have 7 minutes and 43 seconds. So if we summarize the verbs that are being used to describe these women's actions, we find that the women who save Moses do what Yahweh does later in the book. So the daughter of Pharaoh came down to the river. She saw the basket. She sent a rescuer. She saw the child. She heard him crying, knew instantly he was a Hebrew, felt sorry for him, and allowed Moses to go with his mother. Miriam asks her, "May I go?" And the daughter of Pharaoh says, "Go," which is isn't that exactly what Moses is about to do? He's about to confront Pharaoh on the banks of the Nile and say, let us go. And Pharaoh says, no, obviously. But Miriam has already done this. She's already played this out with the daughter of Pharaoh and had a positive response. It's fascinating. So in chapter 2:25 and 3:7-10, I'm summarizing here, but Yahweh saw Israel's plight and he knew. He told Moses that he had surely seen their misery, had heard them crying out, knew their sorrow, had come down to rescue them from Egypt and sent Moses to go to Pharaoh. So not all of the verbs are exact. The ones that I've highlighted are. And I think that's so much fun. God does not directly commission any of these women to act. They simply know what to do and they do the right thing. The faith of women who defy Pharaoh is held up as the key to resisting his empire. So, paying attention to these earlier stories about the rescue of Moses helps us to then think again about Zipporah and her rescue. So our question is, how did Zipporah know what to do, right? And according to 2:16, Zipporah is the daughter of a Midianite priest. Perhaps his daughters are ritually trained. I don't know. The people of Midian descended from Abraham's marriage to Keturah, so perhaps the practice of circumcision was passed down to their family as well. I don't know. But the Zipporah story helps us to frame the rescue of Moses, and this passage also introduces the rescue of Israel by Yahweh. So the priority of circumcision and the spilling of blood anticipates the Passover celebration. Both rituals offer protection against the death of the firstborn at the hand of Yahweh. And in both rituals, blood is applied by touching, nagah, first the feet and then the door. According to chapter 12, verses 43-49, circumcision is the prerequisite for the Passover. Male foreigners may not participate in the Passover unless every male member of their household underwent circumcision. So Moses could scarcely have issued those instructions if he was not in compliance himself. Theologically speaking, the scene with Zipporah was essential preparation for participation in God's work of deliverance. Literarily speaking, the circumcision on the way to Egypt and for anyone planning to leave Egypt with the Israelites serve as mile markers on the journey of deliverance. A third way in which Exodus 4:18-31 is essential to the literary design of Exodus is the many hyperlinks, thank you, Tim, for that word, with Moses' later conversation with Jethro. So if we take chapter 4, this section that I was highlighting for you, and then set it alongside chapter 18, where Moses encounters Jethro, we see all sorts of connections. In both passages, Moses speaks with Jethro, and Jethro offers a blessing of peace. In both passages, Zipporah travels with Moses' sons. Both passages use the term choten or chatan, which means father-in-law or male-in-law. In both passages, So in the first passage, Aaron greets Moses with a kiss at the mountain of God. And in chapter 18, Moses greets Jethro with a kiss near the mountain of God. There's all kinds of connections between the two. And both passages talk about Aaron and the elders of Israel. So these factors work together to make this odd episode a key transitional piece in the narrative. It's a hinge between Moses' personal story of deliverance and the story of the deliverance of the entire nation. It's in both stories, the identity and status, first of Moses, then of the nation, is clarified, and the status of Israel's ultimate deliverer, Yahweh, is solidified. So it's maybe worth noting at this juncture that Zipporah's statement, "you are a blood relative," uses the same word chatan, or the same root that means father-in-law in 4:18, and the basic meaning is kinship by marriage. So Christopher Hayes argues, through this ritual, Zipporah claims her family's relationship to the divine kinsman, Yahweh. Many people read this with a note of disdain, like, "Oh, you're a blood relative to me," as if she's chiding Moses for his people's bloody traditions. But as the daughter of a priest herself, it seems more likely to me that her statement is part of the ritual that confers the meaning on the action. Its perlocutionary effect is to broker a new relationship with Yahweh for Moses' family. So no matter who Zipporah circumcised, whose feet she touched, and to whom she spoke, her ritual action and statement resolved the uncertainty of their covenant status. Yahweh announced his intention to kill the firstborn of Egypt, and now Moses' family was fully identified with the descendants of Abraham. One more layer of intertextuality I want to show you, and this gets at we had a little hint of it from Andy in the previous presentation, this idea of threat in liminal space. So Moses' near-death experience bears striking resemblance to Jacob's and Balaam's, both of whom have a dangerous encounter with Elohim on their way to encounter the descendants of Abraham. So you can see the connections here in two of the three stories. They leave a father-in-law, journey to meet a brother with an uncertain reception, with wives and sons on a donkey. Like, you can see there's a lot of connections between these three stories. And the narrative pattern that emerges from this comparison highlights the power of a divine encounter in liminal space, as well as the urgency of a right relationship with Yahweh and a commitment to doing his will. No blessing may be found outside of rightly relating to Yahweh. The most urgent task on any journey is to discern the will of God and align oneself with it. So Moses' encounter with Yahweh on his return to Egypt was no anomaly. His experience comported with others who sought an encounter with the covenant people or their land while their own covenant status was in question. So many have been tempted to skip over this story of Zipporah or to just be like, I don't know what to do with this. It seemed enigmatic. It seemed objectionable. How does the picture it paints of a capricious God bent on violence square with other passages that demonstrate Yahweh's mercy and compassion? For me, attending to its literary design has really helped me to see why it's here and why we can't let it go. Zipporah's heroic ritual act and bold declaration resolve the uncertainty of Moses' covenantal status by ensuring compliance with Yahweh's demands. And most notably, this rescue was enacted by a foreign woman, which reinforces the Pentateuchal theme of blessing to the nations for those who bless Israel. Exodus is not and has never been a just so you know book, reporting what happened in an age long ago and far away. I tell my students, this is not just FYI, this happened. Rather, it addresses those who claim allegiance to the community of faith by telling the stories of their emergence as a people from these historic events. Notably then, the story of Zipporah disrupts readers' facile assumptions about the nature of the God who rescues and redeems. Yahweh's actions expose the gap between readers' professed faith and our knowledge of the God we claim to serve, preparing us to encounter that mysterious God more fully. Zipporah's decisiveness calls into question the xenophobia and sexism that have so often plagued the people of God. The hero of this story is a foreigner and a woman, a Midianite of priestly descent who appears to know Yahweh better than we do. And not only is this woman allowed into the community, without her, we would have no Exodus. She is its heroine. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Imes. I don't know about you, but I'm just going to be smiling all day because it's just so good. And I love looking around the room. Everyone's like, oh, yes, it's so good. So we do have a couple of questions for you, Dr. Imes. The first is, does this parallel in some way with Jesus being both Egyptian and Hebrew by nature of his upbringing?
Well, absolutely, there are parallels, and Matthew brings them out so beautifully that by using the words of Hosea 11:1, "Out of Egypt I called my son," to describe Jesus. Jesus, his own story recapitulates the Exodus in reverse. He goes to Egypt to be saved instead of coming out of Egypt to be saved. And so, yes, there's certainly parallels, fruitful parallels here to explore.
Excellent. And another question, how does this context of heroic women impact our interpretation of the Ezer in Genesis? I know you talk about this a lot, so
yes.
It's great.
Yes, so, oh man, I could tell stories. I'll just tell a quick story because I think we're here to celebrate Ray. And so, as you know, I'm a professor at Biola University. I think it's safe to say I would not be a professor today if it wouldn't have been for Ray sitting across the table from me in this cafeteria and saying, "Carmen, have you ever thought about being a lab instructor for me?" And I said, "So that's a Bible class, and I'm a woman, and is that okay? Like, do we do that? Can women teach Bible? And Ray said, I think so. And so he brought me up to his office and sat me down and took me through all of the passages about women and showed me how he read those passages. And I walked away convinced, like, I actually think it's okay for me to do what I feel like I'm passionate about, which is study the Bible and then share what I'm learning with others. And if it wouldn't have been... If Ray hadn't taken the time to see something in me and call that out and then shepherd me through that process, I wouldn't be doing it today because I thought I wasn't allowed to. And so as I think about this this word azer in Genesis 2:18, where God has made Adam and then it's not good for man to be alone, I will make him an azer, kenegdo, a helper suitable to him is how it's often translated. And I'm deeply convinced that helper is not the right way to translate that word, because in English that sounds like some kind of subservience. It sounds like what a slave would do for a master or what an employee would do for an employer. And I've looked up every occurrence of that word in its noun form and verbal form in the whole Bible. There's about 100 occurrences, and half of those describe Yahweh as Israel's azer, and the other half describe military allies. So if you're in battle and you are losing the battle and you need help, you need an azer, which is not somebody to make you sandwiches, right? So as I came to Exodus and began to work on my commentary, I was confronted just in the first 2 chapters with all kinds of women who are doing very bold things to defy Pharaoh, and they're absolutely being an azer. They're allying themselves to God's work, again, without divine commission. Sometimes God speaks to us and God indicates to us in profound ways, this is what I want you to do. But most of the time, we just look out at the world and we see that's not right. Something needs to be done. And then we respond, okay, I'm going to do something about this thing that needs to be done. And that's what the women do in Exodus. And I think they're a model for all of us, male or female.
Fantastic. What do you think, Dr. Carmen Imes?